I came home expecting quiet, just another evening in the house I had built piece by piece over 40 years. Instead, I found a young woman standing barefoot in my kitchen, sipping tea from my favorite mug like she belonged there. She didn't flinch when she saw me. She smiled. "Oh, you must be Sophia," she said casually. "Daniel told me you'd be emotional. It's probably best if you pack your things tonight. This house isn't yours anymore." Upstairs, I could hear my husband moving, but he didn't come down. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just looked at her and smiled back, because she had no idea what house she was really standing in. If this moment caught your attention, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what you would have done in my place. Don't forget to like and subscribe if stories like this speak to you, and tell me honestly, would you have walked away or stayed and fought? My name is Sophia Bennett, and for most of my adult life, people believed I was the quiet woman standing beside a successful man. They weren't entirely wrong, but they were never entirely right either. If you had asked anyone in Charleston about Daniel Bennett, they would have described him the same way: charismatic visionary, the kind of man who could walk into a room and leave with a deal before dessert was served. He built a reputation as a real estate developer who revitalized history, restoring old Southern homes and turning them into something elegant, desirable, profitable. And I was always there, smiling, hosting, supporting, invisible. What they didn't see was the version of Daniel that came home late, loosened his tie, and tossed folders onto the kitchen counter for me to handle. They didn't see the spreadsheets I stayed up all night fixing, the legal language I learned just to make sure we didn't lose everything after one of his ambitious risks. They didn't see how many times I quietly corrected his mistakes before anyone else ever noticed them. I wasn't just his wife. I was the foundation he stood on. But foundations don't get credit. They just hold everything up until they crack. When Daniel and I first married, we had nothing. I still remember our first property, a crumbling duplex on the edge of town that smelled like mildew and regret. Everyone told us it was a bad investment. Even Daniel hesitated, but I didn't. I walked through those broken rooms and saw possibility. I talked to a small local lender who had already turned Daniel down twice. I brought him detailed projections, renovation plans, and a repayment schedule I had spent weeks calculating by hand. I remember sitting across from that man, my palms sweating, my voice steady, convincing him to take a chance on us. He didn't trust Daniel. He trusted me. That loan changed everything. We worked side by side in those early years, painting walls, negotiating contracts, learning as we went. Daniel had charm. He could talk anyone into anything, but I had patience, structure, caution. Where he leaped, I measured, and together we built something real. Or at least, I thought we did. Somewhere along the way, success changed him. It didn't happen overnight. It never does. At first, it was small things. He started caring more about appearances, designer suits, expensive watches, the right people at the right tables. Then came the networking events, the late dinners, the urgent meetings that always seemed to stretch just a little too long. I told myself it was part of growth, that this was what success required. But success has a way of revealing who someone already is. And Daniel began to enjoy being admired more than being accountable. I remember the first time I heard Chloe Parker's name. "She's just helping with social media," Daniel said casually, scrolling through his phone at the dinner table. Young, energetic. Knows how to modernize our brand. I didn't think much of it at the time. We were in our 60s. Of course, we needed someone younger to handle that kind of thing. But then I started noticing changes. New photo shoots that focused more on Daniel than the properties. Late-night messages lighting up his phone with a name saved under a simple C. Cologne he hadn't worn in years suddenly reappearing on the bathroom counter. And then there were the smiles. Not the ones he gave clients or colleagues, but the private ones, the kind that belonged to someone who was being admired again, by someone new. I could have confronted him then. Maybe I should have. But instead I chose silence. Not because I was weak, because I was calculating. We had built more than a marriage. We had built a network of properties, investments, partnerships. Untangling that kind of life isn't as simple as walking away. And more than anything, we had Lauren. Our daughter had always been sharper than either of us gave her credit for. She saw things felt things, understood people in ways that made me both proud and uneasy. It was Lauren who first said it out loud. "Mom," she told me one afternoon, her voice careful but firm, "Dad's hiding something, and I don't think it's just an affair." I remember laughing it off at first, not because I believed she was wrong, but because I wasn't ready to admit she might be right. "What makes you say that?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Lauren hesitated, then leaned forward. "I've been looking at some of the numbers from the last few projects," she said. "Things don't add up. Costs are inflated in some places, missing in others. It's like money's being moved or hidden." That was the first time a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with Chloe. Affairs are painful, but financial deception, that's something deeper, something colder. Still, I told myself there had to be an explanation. There always had been before. Daniel made bold moves, yes, but I was always there to stabilize the consequences. I assumed this would be no different. I assumed I still had control. Looking back now, I realize that was my mistake. Control is something you think you have until the moment someone else decides you don't. Standing in that kitchen earlier with Chloe leaning against my counter and Daniel hiding upstairs, I finally saw the full picture. Not just the betrayal, but the assumption behind it. They both believed I would leave quietly, that I would gather my belongings, preserve my dignity, and disappear into whatever smaller life Daniel had arranged for me. A condo, he had said, comfortable, appropriate, as if my entire existence could be neatly folded into a space he approved of, as if the last 40 years could be reduced to something manageable. So, what neither of them understood was this: I had spent decades preparing for possibilities they never even considered. While Daniel chased expansion, I protected structure. While he signed papers quickly, I read every line twice. While he built an image, I built safeguards, and the house they were so eager to claim. It was never as simple as Daniel made it seem. I could still see Chloe's face when I asked that question. "Did he show you the actual property records?" The confidence in her eyes flickered, just for a second, but I saw it. And Daniel, upstairs silent. Daniel knew exactly why I asked, because buried under years of assumptions, signatures, and carefully constructed appearances was a truth neither of them was ready to face, and I had finally decided I was done protecting them from it. There's a particular kind of silence that settles into a marriage long before anything breaks. It doesn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It comes quietly, layer by layer, until one day you realize you've been living beside someone instead of with them. Daniel and I didn't start that way. In the beginning, we were loud, messy, alive. We argued over paint colors, laughed over burned dinners, celebrated every small win like it meant everything, because back then it did. We didn't have much, but what we had felt shared, earned. I remember one night vividly. We were standing in that first duplex surrounded by peeling wallpaper and dust thick enough to taste. Daniel had just gotten off the phone with yet another lender who had turned him down. "This is a mistake," he muttered, running his hand through his hair. "We're going to lose everything before we even start." I looked around the room, then back at him. "No," I said. "We're going to build something no one can take from us." I believed that. I really did. And for a long time it felt true. We worked endlessly in those early years. While Daniel charmed contractors and negotiated prices, I handled permits, schedules, budgets. I learned how to read contracts like a second language, how to anticipate problems before they surfaced. I became the quiet force behind every deal that succeeded. When things went right, Daniel celebrated. When things went wrong, I fixed them. That was our rhythm. And somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling balanced. Success didn't just change our lifestyle. It changed the way Daniel saw himself and the way he saw me. He began introducing me differently. "This is my wife Sophia," he'd say at events, his hand lightly resting on my back. "She keeps everything running." It sounded like praise, but it felt like reduction. I wasn't his partner anymore. I was his support system. And support systems, by definition, are meant to stay in the background. I ignored it at first. I told myself it was natural, that after years of struggle, he deserved to enjoy the spotlight, that my role had simply evolved. But evolution should go both ways, and ours didn't. Daniel became more visible. I became more invisible. And then came the shift I couldn't ignore. Chloe Parker. At first, she existed only in passing mentions. She's helping modernize our brand. She's got great instincts for what younger buyers want. She's bringing fresh energy. I didn't feel threatened. Why would I? I was his wife, his partner of decades, the woman who had stood beside him when he had nothing. A 30-year-old assistant wasn't competition, until she was. The first time I saw her in person was at a company event. She was everything I wasn't anymore, effortlessly polished, confident in a way that comes from never having had to struggle, dressed in a way that drew attention without asking for it. She laughed easily, touched Daniel's arm when she spoke, looked at him like he was extraordinary. And Daniel, he looked back. That was the moment something inside me shifted, not because I felt replaced, but because I recognized the look on his face. It was the same one he used to give me. I watched them from across the room, my expression calm, my posture composed. Years of practice had made me excellent at that, appearing unbothered when something inside me was quietly unraveling. Later that night, I brought it up, casually. "Chloe seems comfortable with you," I said as we got ready for bed. Daniel didn't even look up from his phone. "She's young. That's how they are now. It's nothing. That word settled heavily between us, because nothing is often where everything begins. After that, the signs became impossible to ignore. Late meetings that didn't require preparation, trips that suddenly included team members he had never mentioned before, messages that lit up his phone at odd hours, always brief, always just enough to suggest more. And then there was the change in him. Daniel became sharper, less patient, more critical. He started correcting small things about me, my tone, my clothing, the way I spoke in public. Maybe something a little more modern, he said once, glancing at my outfit before an event. "We're in a different market now. Except it didn't feel like we anymore. It felt like he had already moved forward, and I was being asked to catch up to a version of life I hadn't agreed to." That's when Lauren stepped in. She had always been close to me, but there was a period where she grew distant from Daniel. I thought it was just the natural tension between a strong-willed father and an independent daughter. I was wrong. One afternoon, she came over unannounced. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open, her expression tense. "Mom," she said the moment I walked in, "we need to talk." Something in her voice made my chest tighten. "What is it?" She hesitated, then turned the screen toward me. Spreadsheets, numbers, transactions. At first glance, it looked like any other set of financial reports, but Lauren had highlighted certain entries. "These don't make sense," she said. "Look at the renovation budgets for the Harbor Street property, and then compare them to the contractor invoices." I leaned in, scanning the figures. She was right, they didn't match. Not slightly, significantly. "Maybe it's just delayed reporting," I suggested, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't enough to explain the discrepancy. Lauren shook her head. "I thought that too, so I checked multiple projects." She clicked through several tabs. Each one told the same story. Inflated costs, missing allocations, money moving in ways that didn't follow any logical pattern. "Mom," she said quietly, "this isn't sloppy accounting, this is intentional." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. Daniel had always been risky, but he had never been careless. Not like this. "What are you saying?" I asked, though I already understood. Lauren met my eyes. "I think Dad is moving money, and I don't think it's legal." The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closer, the air heavier. For years I had been bracing myself for the possibility of infidelity. I had not prepared for this, because an affair breaks your heart, the financial deception that dismantles your entire reality. Everything we had built, every property, every investment, every promise for the future, it all depended on trust. And if Daniel had broken that, then I wasn't just standing in a broken marriage. I was standing in something far more dangerous. Still, I did what I had always done. I stayed calm. "I'll look into it," I told her. "There has to be an explanation." Lauren didn't argue, but she didn't look convinced either. And as she packed up her laptop, she paused at the door. "Mom," she said softly, "just don't ignore this, please." I nodded, but deep down I already knew. I wasn't ignoring it. I was delaying the moment I would have to face what it meant. Standing in my kitchen now with Chloe's voice still echoing in my ears and Daniel's silence hanging heavily upstairs, that moment had finally arrived. This wasn't just about a younger woman trying to take my place. It wasn't even just about a husband who had lost his way. This was about something far more deliberate, far more calculated, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had been avoiding for months. Not just what Daniel had done, but how long he had been planning it. Chloe crossed her arms as if she owned the air between us. "You heard me," she said, her voice tightening now that my silence hadn't broken into submission. "Daniel already made arrangements. There's a condo downtown. It's clean, quiet, appropriate. Appropriate." That word echoed in my mind, oddly louder than everything else she had said. I let my eyes drift slowly around the kitchen. The marble countertops I had chosen after weeks of searching the cabinets, I had redesigned 3 times before settling on a finish that would age gracefully the light fixtures I had insisted on importing because nothing local captured the tone I wanted. Every inch of that space carried my decisions, my time, my taste, my life, and yet here she was standing in the center of it, reducing me to something that could be relocated, like furniture, like a mistake. Behind her, I heard footsteps on the stairs, measured, unhurried. Daniel. He appeared at the bottom landing with the same composed expression he used in negotiations, calm, detached, as if emotion were something he could simply choose not to participate in. For a brief second, our eyes met. 40 years of marriage compressed into a single look, and what I saw there wasn't guilt. It was calculation. "Sophia," he said evenly, adjusting the cuff of his shirt as he stepped into the room. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Harder, as if difficulty were something I was introducing, as if betrayal had been convenient." I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Chloe shifted her weight, glancing between us. Daniel exhaled lightly. "I've already taken care of everything," he continued. "The condo is fully furnished. It's in a good neighborhood. You won't have to worry about anything." There it was again. That tone. That quiet assumption that he was still the one in control. That he could rearrange my life the way he rearranged assets cleanly, efficiently, without resistance. "And what exactly do you think I'm supposed to do there?" I asked. Finally, my voice calm. Daniel hesitated just for a fraction of a second. "Live comfortably," he said. "We'll make sure you're provided for." "Well," I almost smiled at that. Chloe straightened, slightly emboldened now that Daniel had entered the conversation. "It's really the best option," she added, her voice softening into something that almost resembled sympathy. "You don't want to drag this out. It'll just make things messy." Messy. The word hung in the air like a warning, or a threat. I turned my head slowly and looked at her. Really looked this time. At the careful makeup, the expensive blouse, the confidence that came from believing she had already won. She wasn't just repeating Daniel's plan. She believed in it. That was the most dangerous part. "You think this is your house now?" I said quietly. It wasn't a question. Chloe blinked, caught slightly off guard by the directness. "Well," she said, lifting her chin, "Daniel and I are building a future together. So yes, I'd say that makes it ours. Ours." I let the words settle. Then I nodded slowly. "I see." Daniel shifted impatience flickering across his face. "Sophia," he said more firmly, "there's no need to get into semantics. The important thing is moving forward in a way that avoids unnecessary conflict. Unnecessary conflict. I almost admired how carefully he chose his words, always positioning himself as reasonable, measured, above the chaos he himself created. For years that approach had worked. On business partners, on clients, even on me, but not anymore. I took a step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to change the dynamic. "Daniel." I said, my tone still even. "Did you explain everything to her?" His jaw tightened. "Explain what?" he asked. I held his gaze. The property. The word landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far. Chloe frowned slightly. "What are you talking about?" Daniel didn't answer. That was all the confirmation I needed. I turned back to her. "Did he show you the ownership records?" I asked. She laughed lightly, though it sounded forced. "I don't need to see paperwork," she said. "I trust him." Trust, such a fragile word. "So did I replied. That silenced her. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room shifted, subtle but undeniable. Chloe looked at Daniel now, a small crease forming between her brows. "Daniel," she prompted. He sighed, running a hand over his face as if this were all just an inconvenience. "It's not relevant," he said quickly. "The structure is complicated, that's all. Sophia handled most of that side of things. Handled, as if it were a minor detail. As if the legal framework behind everything we owned wasn't the very thing holding it together." I tilted my head slightly. "Complicated," I repeated. That's one way to put it. Chloe's confidence wavered just slightly. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice no longer as steady. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked past her, trailing my fingers lightly across the edge of the counter, grounding myself in something familiar. I spent years making sure this house would always be protected. I said, my voice softer now, but clearer, protected from what she asked. I stopped, turned back, and looked directly at Daniel. "From bad decisions," I said. His eyes darkened. "That's enough," he snapped. But I wasn't speaking to him anymore. I was speaking to the illusion standing in front of me. "This house," I continued, my gaze returning to Chloe, "isn't owned the way you think it is." Her lips parted slightly. Daniel took a step forward. "Sophia." "No," I said, cutting him off calmly. "You wanted to handle this like adults, didn't you?" He froze, because he knew what I was about to do, and for the first time since I walked into that kitchen, I saw something I hadn't seen in him in a long time. Uncertainty. Chloe's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "What are you saying?" I met her eyes. "I'm saying," I replied, "that you might want to understand exactly where you're standing before you start telling people to leave it." Silence followed, heavy, unavoidable, and upstairs, somewhere in the house that was no longer what either of them believed it to be, something had already begun to shift. Chloe didn't speak right away. She stood there still holding my mug, but now her fingers tightened slightly around it as if it were the only solid thing left in a room that had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. "What does that mean?" she asked again, slower this time. Daniel stepped forward, his voice sharpening. "It means nothing," he said quickly. "Sophia is trying to complicate something that's very simple." Simple. I let out a quiet breath. For years, Daniel had relied on that word, used it like a tool. If something felt too complicated, too layered, too uncomfortable, he would reduce it, flatten it, make it simple so no one would question it further. It had worked on business partners, it had worked on investors, it had even worked on me, until it didn't. "Is it simple?" I asked, looking at him steadily. His jaw tightened. "This isn't the time," he said. "We can discuss technicalities later." Technicalities? I almost laughed. Because to him, the structure I had spent years building, the legal protections, the ownership layers, the safeguards, were just technicalities. Details he had never bothered to understand. Details that were now about to matter more than anything else in his life. Chloe shifted again, her eyes moving between us. "Daniel," she said, her voice quieter now. "What is she talking about?" He didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation, small as it was, spoke louder than anything else. I watched it land on her, the doubt, the first real crack. So I gave it space to grow. Years ago, I began calmly after one of Daniel's ambitious investments nearly cost us everything. I made a decision. Daniel's eyes flashed. "Sophia, I made a decision." I repeated, not raising my voice, but not stopping either, to ensure that no single person could ever put our entire life at risk again. Chloe's brows drew together. "What does that have to do with the house?" she asked. "Everything," I said. I walked toward the dining table where a stack of neatly arranged folders still sat from the night before. I hadn't touched them yet, but I had already reviewed every page in my mind 100 times. I didn't need to open them. I knew what was inside. This house, I continued, resting my hand lightly on the back of a chair, was never purchased under Daniel Bennett's name. Chloe blinked. "That's not possible," she said quickly. "He told me." "I'm sure he did," I replied gently. Her lips parted, then pressed together again. Daniel's voice cut in sharper now. "The house is part of our portfolio," he said. "That's all she means. It's standard practice." Standard practice? Another familiar phrase. Comforting, vague, and completely misleading. "Yes," I said. "It is part of the portfolio." I met Chloe's eyes again. "But not in the way you think." The room felt smaller now, tighter, like the walls themselves were listening. Then explain it, she said, a trace of urgency creeping into her voice. I tilted my head slightly. You're very confident for someone who hasn't seen a single document, I said. That stung. I saw it in the way her shoulders stiffened. I don't need to see documents, she shot back, though her voice lacked its earlier certainty. Daniel wouldn't lie to me. Wouldn't lie. I held that sentence in my mind for a moment, turned it over, examined it. Then I nodded slowly. I used to believe that too. That landed harder than anything else I had said. Silence followed, heavy, unavoidable. Daniel exhaled sharply. This is pointless, he said. Sophia is trying to create confusion. The reality is this is my house. There it was. The word he had built his entire identity around. I stepped closer. Not aggressively. Just enough to stand directly across from him. Is it? I asked quietly. Our eyes locked. For a second, I saw the version of him I used to know, the man who had stood in that first duplex, uncertain but willing to trust me. But that version was gone. What stood in front of me now was someone who believed his own narrative more than he believed the truth. Yes, he said firmly. It is. I nodded. Then tell her, I said. He frowned. Tell her what I held his gaze. Tell her the name on the controlling entity. That did it. His expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough, Chloe noticed. What controlling entity, she asked, turning toward him. Daniel didn't answer, and that silence, longer this time, was no longer something he could smooth over. I spoke before he could recover. Bennett and Hayes Holdings, I said. Chloe repeated it under her breath. Hayes. She looked back at Daniel. You said everything was under your name. It is, he said quickly. This is just a technical structure. No, I said, cutting in softly. It isn't just that. I let the next words come slowly, clearly, so there would be no misunderstanding. Bennett and Hayes Holdings is a jointly controlled entity, I explained, which means Daniel does not and cannot make unilateral decisions about assets under it. Chloe stared at me, then at him, then back at me. You're saying... She hesitated, her voice faltering. He can't just give this house to someone I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. The answer was already settling into her, but I gave it to her anyway. No, I said gently. He can't. The mug in her hand lowered slowly onto the counter, carefully, like she was afraid of dropping it, or maybe afraid of what would happen if she didn't stay composed. Daniel stepped forward, his voice rising. This is being blown out of proportion, he said. I have full operational control. I repeated. Another word he liked, another word that sounded powerful, until you understood its limits. Yes, I said. You do. I paused, then added quietly, but not ownership. That was the moment everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Chloe's eyes widened just slightly. Her posture changed. The confidence that had carried her through this entire confrontation began to dissolve. Daniel, she said slowly, is that true? He didn't look at her. He was still looking at me, as if trying to figure out how much I was willing to say, how far I was willing to go. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't have the answer. I folded my hands loosely in front of me, calm, steady, done pretending. You should ask him something else, I said softly, my eyes still on his. Chloe swallowed. When I finally turned to her, you should ask him. I said why he never thought it was important for you to know that. The question hung in the air, sharp, unavoidable. And in that moment, I realized something with absolute clarity. This wasn't just about revealing the truth. It was about watching what happened when the illusion could no longer survive it. For a long moment, no one moved. The kitchen, the same kitchen that had held birthdays, late-night conversations, and quiet cups of tea, felt like a stage where something irreversible had just been revealed. Chloe was the first to break. She turned fully toward Daniel, now her voice no longer soft, no longer rehearsed. Why didn't you tell me that, she asked. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Daniel exhaled slowly the way he always did when he was about to regain control of a situation, or at least attempt to. It's not relevant, he said again, though the words came faster this time, less polished. Ownership structures like that are normal. It doesn't change anything. It changes everything, Chloe said, her tone sharpening. I watched her closely. The entitlement was still there. The pride, but underneath it now, something else had surfaced. Fear. And not the kind that comes from guilt, the kind that comes from realizing you may have been misled. Daniel stepped closer to her, lowering his voice slightly. Chloe, he said you're overreacting. This is just Sophia trying to create confusion. She's always handled the legal side. She likes to make things sound more complicated than they are. Likes. I almost smiled at that, as if I had built entire legal protections out of preference, as if caution were a personality trait instead of a necessity. Chloe didn't look convinced. Her eyes flicked toward me again. Then explain it, she said, clearly. Daniel hesitated, and that hesitation lingered just a little too long. So I stepped in, not to rescue him, but to end the performance. Daniel has operational authority within the company, I said calmly. He can oversee projects, negotiate deals, manage development timelines. I paused. But major decisions involving core assets like this house require joint authorization. Joint with who? Chloe asked quickly. I held her gaze, with Edward Hayes. The name landed with weight, even if she didn't fully understand why. Chloe blinked. Who is that? Daniel's silence answered before I did. But I spoke anyway. My father's business partner, I said, and the co-controller of Bennett and Hayes Holdings. Her eyes widened slightly. You mean, she hesitated, trying to piece it together. Daniel can't just sell this house or transfer it. No, I said, he can't. The room fell quiet again, but this silence was different. It wasn't tense. It was shifting, like something fragile had just broken. Chloe took a small step back, not dramatically, just enough to create space between her and him. I don't understand, she said more to herself than to either of us. You told me everything was under your control. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration beginning to show. It is under control, he insisted. You're focusing on the wrong thing. No, she said, her voice rising now. I'm focusing on the fact that you didn't tell me the truth. There it was, not anger at me. Not defensiveness, but betrayal, a mirror of what I had felt for months. And in that moment, something inside me shifted not toward sympathy, but toward clarity. This wasn't about her replacing me. This was about a man who had built his entire life on half-truths, finally being forced to face them. Daniel turned sharply toward me. You're enjoying this, he said, his voice low-edged with accusation. I met his gaze evenly. No, I replied. I'm correcting it. That only made him angrier. You always do this, he snapped. You twist things, you make everything sound worse than it is. Worse than it is. I let that settle. Then I asked quietly, do you want me to explain the rest? He froze, because he knew what the rest meant. Chloe looked between us again. What rest? She asked. Daniel shook his head quickly. There is no rest, he said. This is already more than necessary. I tilted my head slightly. Is it? I asked. Then I turned away from him. Not dismissively, deliberately, and walked toward the study just off the hallway. I could feel them watching me, waiting, trying to anticipate what I would do next. For years, Daniel had been the one who controlled information, revealed it, withheld it, shaped it. Now, for the first time, that role had shifted. I opened the study door and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of paper and polish, familiar grounding. This was where I had spent countless nights reviewing contracts, balancing accounts, fixing problems no one else even knew existed. This was where the real work had always been done. I moved to the desk and opened the top drawer. Inside, neatly arranged, were copies of documents I had never thought I would need to use like this. But I had kept them anyway, because some part of me had always understood that protection wasn't just about structure. It was about readiness. I took out a single folder, closed the drawer, and walked back into the kitchen. Chloe's eyes immediately dropped to the folder in my hand. Daniel's expression darkened. Sophia, he said, his voice tight. This is unnecessary. I stopped a few feet from them. Is it? I asked again. He didn't answer. Because now, he wasn't sure. I placed the folder gently on the counter, not with force, not as a threat, just there. Present, real. This, I said, resting my fingertips lightly on it, is a copy of the original ownership agreement for Bennett and Hayes Holdings. Chloe stared at it like it might explain everything on its own. What does it say? She asked. I looked at her. It says that no individual, Daniel included, has unilateral authority over primary residential assets acquired under the company. Her breathing slowed, careful, measured, like she was trying to stay composed while something inside her recalculated. "And this house?" she asked. I nodded. "Is one of those assets." Daniel stepped forward suddenly. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm now, edged with something close to desperation. "We're not going through legal documents in the middle of a personal situation." Personal. The word almost felt ironic, because nothing about this was just personal anymore. Not when finances, ownership, and deception were all tangled together. I looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel intimidated. I didn't feel uncertain. I didn't feel like I needed to keep the peace. "All of this became more than personal the moment you decided to rewrite reality," I said quietly. He held my gaze, and I saw it then. The realization. Not that he had been caught, but that I was no longer going to protect him from the consequences. Chloe's voice came again, softer now. "So, what happens?" she asked. I turned to her and answered honestly. "That," I said, "depends on how much of the truth you're ready to hear." And as the words settled into the space between us, I understood something with absolute certainty. This wasn't the end of the confrontation. It was just the beginning. Chloe didn't respond immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the folder as if it might open itself and give her the version of reality she preferred. But documents don't comfort people. They expose them. Daniel stepped closer to the counter, his presence suddenly more aggressive. Not loud, not chaotic, but controlled, in that familiar way he used when he was trying to contain something slipping out of his grasp. "We're done here," he said, his tone clipped. "This has gone far enough." I didn't move. I didn't touch the folder again. I simply looked at him. Far enough for who I asked. That question landed harder than I expected, because for the first time, Daniel didn't have an immediate answer. He wasn't used to being challenged without emotion, without escalation, without something he could dismiss as irrational. And that was exactly why I stayed calm. Chloe finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. "No," she said. "We're not done." Daniel turned toward her, clearly irritated. "Chloe, I need to understand what's going on," she interrupted, "because right now, nothing you've told me makes sense anymore." There it was again, that fracture, that widening gap between what she had believed and what was now undeniable. Daniel exhaled sharply, running his hand through his hair. "This is being twisted," he said. "The structure doesn't change the fact that I run everything. I built this business. I watched him carefully. There was truth in that statement, but it wasn't the whole truth. And the whole truth is what changes everything." "You built the front of it," I said quietly. His eyes snapped to mine. "And I built the parts that kept it from collapsing," I added. That stung. I saw it in the tightening of his jaw, the slight shift in his posture, because no matter how much he wanted to deny it, he knew it was true. Chloe looked between us again, her expression tightening with confusion and something else, something sharper. "Okay," she said slowly. "Let's say that's all true. What does that actually mean right now?" A fair question, a necessary one. I took a breath. "It means," I said, choosing my words carefully, "that Daniel cannot legally remove me from this house. He cannot transfer it. He cannot assign it. And he cannot make decisions about it alone." Her lips parted slightly. "So when you told me," she turned to Daniel, her voice tightening, "that this was your house to give." Daniel cut in quickly. "I didn't say that exactly." "You implied it," she shot back. Silence. And in that silence, something fundamental shifted. This wasn't just tension anymore. It was unraveling. Daniel turned away from her, pacing once across the kitchen before stopping near the window. "This is getting out of control," he muttered. No, it was getting clear. And clarity is what people like Daniel fear the most. I leaned lightly against the counter, grounding myself. "There's more," I said. He froze. Chloe looked at me again. More what I didn't answer right away. Instead, I studied Daniel, gave him a chance, a final one. "If you want to explain it," I said to him, "you can." He didn't turn around, didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge the offer. And that told me everything I needed to know. So I continued. "Over the past year," I said calmly, "I started noticing inconsistencies." Daniel's shoulders tensed. Chloe's attention sharpened. In the financial reports, I added. Chloe frowned. "What kind of inconsistencies?" I glanced briefly toward the folder, then back at her. "Inflated renovation costs," I said. "Missing allocations. Payments routed through secondary vendors that don't match any approved contracts. Her expression shifted again, from confusion to concern. "And what does that mean?" she asked. I held her gaze. "It means money has been moving in ways it shouldn't." Daniel turned then. "Quickly. That's speculation," he said sharply. "You don't have proof of anything." I didn't raise my voice. "I have patterns," I replied. "That's not the same thing." "No," I agreed, "it's not." I paused, then added, "But it's where proof begins." Chloe looked at him, now her eyes searching his face. "Daniel," she said. He shook his head. "Frustration building. This is exactly what she does," he said. "She takes small discrepancies and turns them into something bigger. It's how she justifies controlling everything. Controlling. That word used to hurt. Now it almost amused me, because what he called control was actually accountability. "You asked what this means," I said, turning back to Chloe. She nodded slowly. "It means," I continued, "that this situation isn't just personal, it's legal." That landed heavily. Legal. A word that carries weight even when people don't fully understand it. Chloe's voice dropped. "Are you saying he did something illegal?" Daniel scoffed. "Absolutely not." I didn't answer immediately, because this wasn't about making accusations. It was about letting reality settle in on its own. I'm saying I replied carefully that there are enough irregularities to require review. Chloe swallowed. "And what happens if there is a review?" I looked at her steadily. "Everything gets examined." The words hung in the air, heavy, final. Daniel's expression hardened. "You wouldn't," he said, not loudly, but with a certainty that came from years of believing I wouldn't cross certain lines. I met his gaze. "You're right," I said softly. For a moment, relief flickered across his face. Then I finished I wouldn't have. Past tense. That was the part that mattered. His relief vanished, replaced by something else, something sharper. "You're overreacting," he said, though the conviction in his voice had weakened. "This is a misunderstanding." "No," I said. "It's a pattern." Chloe stepped back again, creating even more distance between herself and him. "I need to sit down," she muttered. She moved to one of the chairs, lowering herself slowly, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the reality underneath. She wasn't just embarrassed. She was recalculating, reevaluating everything she thought she knew, everything she had been promised. I watched her carefully. Not with sympathy, but with understanding, because I had been there too, not in her position, but in that moment of realization when the version of someone you believed in no longer matches the truth standing in front of you. Daniel looked between us, his control slipping further. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're both blowing this out of proportion." No, we weren't. For the first time in a long time, we were seeing it clearly. I straightened slightly. "There's a clause," I said. Daniel's head snapped toward me, and this time the reaction wasn't subtle. It was immediate, visible, sharp. "What clause?" Chloe asked. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on him because he knew. He had signed it, years ago, without reading, without asking, trusting me to handle the details, and I had, carefully, deliberately. For moments exactly like this. A clause, I repeated slowly, that triggers a full review of all company assets if unauthorized actions are attempted. Chloe's breath caught. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak, didn't deny it, because he couldn't. And trying to remove me from this house, I added, quietly qualifies. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was final, because in that moment, everything shifted from possibility to consequence. And Daniel finally understood something he had spent years ignoring. I wasn't just the woman who built his life. I was the one who could take it apart. The silence that followed my words didn't feel like a pause. It felt like a line, one that had just been crossed and couldn't be uncrossed. Daniel was the first to move, not toward me, but away. He turned, pacing slowly across the kitchen, his steps measured but no longer controlled in the way I had always known. There was tension in his shoulders, now visible, undeniable. "You're exaggerating," he said finally, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "That clause is a safeguard. It's not meant for something like this. Something like this." I let that phrase settle for a moment. Then I asked quietly, "What exactly do you think this is?" He didn't answer, because answering would require him to define the situation honestly, and honesty was no longer something he had the advantage in. Chloe sat at the table, Her hands folded tightly together, her eyes moving between us like she was trying to piece together a puzzle that no longer fit the picture she had been given. "You're saying," she began slowly, "that if he tries to push you out, everything gets reviewed." I nodded, yes. Her throat moved as she swallowed. "And everything means," I didn't soften it, "it means accounts, transactions, contracts, asset transfers, all of it." Daniel stopped pacing. "That's not how it works," he said quickly. "There are thresholds, conditions." "Yes," I agreed, "and attempting to assert control over a protected residential asset without joint authorization meets those conditions." He stared at me, and for the first time in years, he looked uncertain, not angry, not dismissive, uncertain. Chloe leaned back slightly in her chair as if distance could give her clarity. "So if this happens," she said carefully, "people start looking into the company." "Yes," I said. "And if they find something wrong," I held her gaze, "then it stops being a private problem." That was the moment the weight of it truly landed. Not just on her, on all of us. Because what had started as a confrontation in a kitchen had just expanded into something far larger. Daniel ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. "This is insane," he muttered. "You're threatening to destroy everything over a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. I almost felt tired hearing that word again, because it implied something accidental, unintentional, fixable. And nothing about this felt like that anymore. "I'm not threatening anything," I said calmly. "I'm explaining the reality you chose to ignore." He turned toward me again, frustration sharpening his voice. "I didn't ignore it," he said. "I trusted you to handle it." There it was. The truth hidden inside his defense. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said, "you did." He paused as if expecting that agreement to shift something back in his favor. It didn't. "And I did handle it," I continued. "I handled it in a way that made sure neither of us could ever lose everything because of one decision." His expression tightened. "You're acting like I've done something reckless." I didn't respond immediately, because the answer to that was no longer simple. Instead, I asked Daniel, "Where did the Harbor Street overage go?" The question hit him like a physical force. I saw it, in the way his posture stiffened, in the way his eyes flickered just for a second. Chloe noticed too. "What is she talking about?" she asked, her voice tightening again. Daniel recovered quickly. "Project fluctuations," he said. "Unexpected costs. It happens." I tilted my head slightly. 40% over budget, I asked. "That's not unusual in older properties." Without documented change orders, silence. The kind that speaks. Chloe's breathing changed. Slower, more deliberate, as if she were trying to keep herself steady while everything around her shifted. "Daniel," she said quietly, "just answer the question." He looked at her, then at me, then away. "It was handled," he said, finally. "Handled." That word again, so vague, so empty. I stepped closer to the table. Not aggressively, just enough to bring clarity back into the space. "Lauren noticed it first," I said. Daniel's head snapped toward me. "You told her he demanded." "No," I replied. "She told me." That landed differently, because it meant something he hadn't anticipated. Lauren had been watching, understanding, connecting pieces he assumed no one else would see. Chloe's eyes widened slightly. "Lauren knows about this?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "And she thinks something's wrong." I held her gaze. "She thinks something doesn't add up." That was the careful version, the restrained one, the one that didn't yet say everything. Daniel shook his head. Frustration spilling over now. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "You're dragging Lauren into something she doesn't understand." "No," I said quietly. "I'm acknowledging that she understands more than you think." He stared at me, and I could see it. The realization forming, not just that things were slipping, but that they had already slipped. Chloe leaned forward slightly, her voice lower now. "What else don't I know?" The question wasn't directed at me, but I answered anyway. "Enough," I said. She looked at me. "And the problem," I added, "is that the more you understand, the less secure any of this will feel." Her expression tightened, because she already felt it. The shift, the instability, the doubt. Daniel stepped forward again, his voice sharper now, more urgent. "This conversation is over," he said. "We're not turning this into some kind of investigation." I met his gaze. It already is one. That stopped him, because deep down, he knew it was true. The moment questions start forming, the process has already begun. Chloe pushed her chair back slightly, standing now, though she didn't move closer to him. She stayed where she was, in between, not aligned with either of us. I need to understand what's actually happening, she said, because right now, I feel like I walked into something I was never told the truth about. Her voice didn't shake, but it wasn't confident anymore. It was searching, and that made her dangerous in a different way. Because people who start asking real questions don't stop easily. I looked at her for a moment, then said something I hadn't planned to say out loud yet. "You didn't walk into it," I said. She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I held her gaze. "You were brought into it. The distinction mattered, because it shifted responsibility. Not entirely, but enough." Daniel's expression darkened. "Don't," he warned. But I continued. "Whether you realized it or not, I said to her you became part of a situation that was already unstable." She stared at me, trying to decide if I was manipulating her or telling her the truth. "Why would he do that?" she asked. That question was the one Daniel couldn't answer. Not honestly, not without unraveling everything. So I answered it for him, because I said quietly he thought no one would ever challenge him. Silence. Heavy. Final. And in that silence, I realized something with absolute clarity. This wasn't just about exposing what had already happened. It was about what would happen next. Because now, everyone in that room knew enough to change everything. And once that kind of knowledge exists, there's no going back to what things used to be. The silence didn't break all at once. It unraveled, slowly, unevenly, like something fragile pulling apart under its own weight. Chloe was the first to move. She didn't come closer to Daniel. She didn't come closer to me either. Instead, she walked toward the window, wrapping her arms around herself, not dramatically, not theatrically, but instinctively, like someone trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. "I need air," she murmured, though she didn't open the window. Daniel watched her, his jaw tight, his patience thinning. "This is exactly what I didn't want," he said under his breath. I looked at him. "No," I replied quietly. "This is exactly what you planned would never happen." His eyes flicked toward mine, sharp, accusing, but he didn't deny it. Because somewhere beneath all his deflection, he knew. He had counted on silence. Mine, Lauren's, anyone who might have questioned him. And now that silence was gone. Chloe turned back toward us. Her expression had changed again, less emotional, more focused. That was new. "What else?" she asked. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Chloe." "No," she cut in firmer now. "I'm asking a real question, and I want a real answer." She looked at me. "What else is there?" I studied her for a moment, trying to understand what she was really asking, not just for information, but for truth. And truth, once given, doesn't come in pieces. It comes all at once. Still, I didn't rush, because timing matters, especially when what you're about to say will change everything. "Last week I began my voice steady. I attended the Charleston Preservation Gala." Daniel stiffened. Chloe frowned slightly. "What does that have to do with anything?" she asked. "Everything," I said. I moved slowly toward the edge of the kitchen island, resting my hand lightly against it. "That event wasn't just social," I continued. "It was where Daniel meets investors, partners. People who trust him with large amounts of money." Daniel shook his head. "This is irrelevant, is it?" I asked. He didn't answer. Because he knew where this was going. Chloe stepped closer now. "Just say it," she said. So I did. "I overheard a conversation," I said, "between Daniel and one of his financial contacts." Daniel's voice came sharp. "You were eavesdropping. I was listening," I corrected calmly. "There's a difference." Chloe's eyes moved quickly between us. What kind of conversation? I held her gaze. A discussion about liquidating a property. Daniel crossed his arms. "That's part of business. We sell properties all the time." "Yes," I agreed, "but not that one." His silence confirmed it. Chloe noticed. "Which property?" she asked. I paused, not for drama, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way nothing else had yet. "The East Bay Portfolio Unit," I said. Chloe blinked. "That doesn't mean anything to me." Of course it didn't. It wasn't meant to. It was meant to sound technical, distant, harmless, but it wasn't. "That property," I continued, "is tied to a long-term trust structure." Daniel's expression hardened. "Sophia, stop." I didn't. Specifically, I said it's tied to funds allocated for Lauren's future family trust. That changed everything. Chloe's eyes widened. Wait, you mean his daughter? I nodded. Yes. She turned slowly toward Daniel. You're selling something that's meant for her. It's not that simple, he snapped. It sounds pretty simple, she shot back. It's strategic, he insisted. Temporary. I'm repositioning assets. Repositioning, another one of his words. Always neutral, always safe, until you understood what it actually meant. At the cost of your daughter's future, I asked quietly. He looked at me, and for a moment, he didn't have a polished answer. Chloe took a step back, again, further this time. You didn't tell me that, she said. Daniel's voice rose slightly. Because it's not your concern. Her head snapped up. Not my concern, she repeated. You told me we were building a future together, that everything you had was becoming ours. There it was. The promise. The illusion. Spoken out loud for the first time. Daniel's expression shifted just briefly, then hardened again. You're taking this out of context, he said. No, she said, shaking her head slowly. I think I'm finally understanding the context. The room felt different now, not tense, not explosive, but clear, like fog lifting, revealing something that had always been there. Chloe turned toward me, her voice quieter now, more grounded. Is that why you said I was brought into this? She asked. I nodded. Yes, she swallowed. And if he sells that property, what happens? I didn't soften it. The trust weakens, I said. Future allocations change. Long-term security disappears. Her eyes flickered. And you think he was just going to do that? I didn't answer, because she already knew. She looked back at him, and this time, she didn't look confused. She looked betrayed. Daniel noticed, and for the first time, something like urgency entered his voice. You're overreacting, he said. You don't understand how these structures work. No, she said quietly. I think I understand exactly how this works. Silence. Then she added, you tell people what they need to hear, until it stops being useful. That landed harder than anything I had said because it came from her, not me. Daniel's control slipped, just a little. That's not fair, he said. Isn't it? She asked. He didn't respond, because fairness had never really been the point. Control had. I watched them both, carefully, because this moment, this shift, was the beginning of something irreversible. Not just between him and her, but between him and the truth. Chloe exhaled slowly, running a hand through her hair. So what happens now? She asked, her voice steadier than before. It wasn't fear anymore. It was realization. I answered honestly. That depends on what he does next. She looked at Daniel, waiting, expecting, demanding something real for once. He didn't give it. Instead, he looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not arrogance, but calculation, mixed with something else, something closer to concern. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. I met his gaze. No, I replied. I stopped making one. And as the words settled into the space between us, I understood something with complete certainty. This wasn't just about revealing what he had done. It was about forcing him to face what it would cost. Because for the first time in years, Daniel Bennett was no longer the one controlling the narrative. And without that, everything he had built was starting to crack. The cracks didn't widen all at once. They spread, quietly, like something breaking beneath the surface before anyone fully sees it. Chloe stood still for a long moment after my last words, her eyes no longer searching but calculating. The difference was subtle, but I recognized it immediately. She wasn't trying to understand Daniel anymore. She was trying to understand what this meant for her, and that more than anything told me the illusion had already begun to collapse. I need to ask you something, she said finally, her voice steady in a way it hadn't been before. Daniel didn't respond, didn't even look at her. So she asked anyway, how much of what you told me is actually true? Silence. Daniel exhaled slowly, turning toward her with the same expression he used when he was about to regain control of a situation, or try to. You're letting her get in your head, he said. This is exactly what she wants. Chloe didn't move, didn't react. She just held his gaze. That's not an answer. The words were calm, but firm and final. For a moment, Daniel said nothing, and in that moment, he lost more ground than he realized, because when someone asks a direct question and you don't answer it, the answer becomes obvious. I didn't interrupt, didn't need to. This part wasn't mine anymore. Chloe took a breath, then turned toward me. I want to see everything she said. Daniel's head snapped toward her. That's not necessary. It is to me, she replied without looking at him. Her tone had changed. There was no softness left, no rehearsed confidence, just something grounded, something real, and that made her far more dangerous than she had been 10 minutes ago. You're not part of this, Daniel said sharply. This is between me and Sophia. Chloe let out a quiet laugh. Not amused, not light, just disillusioned. That's funny, she said, because a few minutes ago I was a part of the future. Daniel didn't respond, because there was nothing he could say that wouldn't contradict something else he had already told her. I watched the shift happen in real time. Not dramatic, not explosive, but decisive. Chloe stepped away from him, not far, just enough to make a point. Show me the messages, she said to me. Daniel moved quickly, this time stepping between us. No, he said, this is not happening. I looked at him, not angry, not emotional, just finished. You don't get to decide that anymore, I said quietly. That landed. He knew it, I knew it, and now Chloe knew it too. She folded her arms. If there's nothing wrong, then you shouldn't have a problem with it, she said. Daniel turned toward her, frustration rising. You don't understand how this works, he said. Then explain it, she shot back. He didn't, because explanation required consistency, and consistency was gone. I reached for the folder on the counter, not the main one. A thinner one beneath it, the one I hadn't intended to use yet. But moments like this don't wait for perfect timing. They demand clarity. Chloe's eyes followed the movement. What is that? She asked. Communication records, I said. Daniel stepped forward. Sophia, don't. I paused, looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I felt nothing. No hesitation, no instinct to protect him. Just clarity. You already crossed that line, I said. I'm just acknowledging it. Then I opened the folder, carefully, deliberately. Inside were printed exchanges, emails, messages, fragments of conversations that, when placed side by side, told a very clear story. Chloe stepped closer, slowly, as if approaching something she wasn't sure she wanted to see but couldn't avoid. What am I looking at? She asked. I turned one of the pages toward her, read the dates, I said. She leaned in. Her eyes scanned the first line, then the second, then the third. And I watched it happen. That moment, when recognition hits, when pieces connect, when something you suspected becomes undeniable. These are... She hesitated, her voice tightening. They're from before we met. Daniel didn't speak, didn't deny it, because he couldn't. Chloe flipped to the next page, and the next. Her breathing changed, shallower, more controlled, but underneath it, something was breaking. You told me, she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, that everything with her was already over. She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at him. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. It was complicated, he said. Complicated. The safest word for something that isn't safe at all. Chloe let out a short, hollow laugh. No, she said, it wasn't complicated. It was convenient. That word hit him harder than mine had, because it came from her, not me. She turned another page, and this time, she froze, completely. What is this? She asked. Her voice had changed again, not confused, not emotional, but sharp, focused. I didn't need to look. I already knew which message she had landed on. An internal note, I said quietly. She read it again, slower, as if hoping she had misunderstood it the first time. Then she looked up, at him. You were planning to move funds through a secondary vendor account, she said. You said it would be easier to adjust later. Daniel's expression tightened. That's not what it means. Then what does it mean? She asked. He didn't answer, because there wasn't a better version of it. There was only the truth, and the truth didn't sound better. Chloe stepped back, this time further. The distance between them was no longer subtle. It was clear, defined. You lied to me, she said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just plainly. Daniel shook his head. No, I simplified things, simplified. I almost closed my eyes. Because that word had carried so much damage over the years. And here it was again, doing the same thing. Chloe stared at him. And then quietly, she said, You didn't simplify anything. She paused, then added, You just left out the parts that would have made me walk away. That was it. That was the moment. The illusion didn't shatter. It dissolved, and there was nothing left to hold it together. Daniel looked between us. For the first time, uncertain not just about the situation, but about both of us, about what we would do next, about what control he had left. I closed the folder gently, not with finality, but with intention. This isn't about choosing sides, I said quietly. Chloe didn't look at me. She was still looking at him. I already did that, she said. Silence followed, heavy, unavoidable, and in that silence something became absolutely clear. This was no longer a confrontation. It was a reckoning, and Daniel was finally standing in the middle of it. The reckoning didn't arrive with shouting. It arrived with absence. Chloe didn't storm out. She didn't cry. She didn't say another word. She just stepped back, picked up her purse, and walked toward the door without looking at either of us. The sound of it closing behind her wasn't loud, but it echoed, because something had just ended and none of us needed it explained. Daniel stood still for a moment, staring at the empty space where she had been. Then he turned to me. "This is what you wanted," he said. His voice wasn't angry. Not exactly. It was something colder, more controlled, like he was trying to rebuild his footing from whatever pieces were left. I held his gaze. "No," I said quietly. "This is what you created." That should have been the moment where everything escalated, where years of silence turned into argument, where anger finally surfaced. But it didn't, because anger requires energy, and I was past that. Daniel walked toward the counter, resting his hands against it, his head lowering slightly, as if the weight of everything had finally caught up with him. "You've gone too far," he said after a moment. I didn't respond right away, because I had heard that before, not in words, but in implication. Anytime I questioned something, anytime I pushed back, anytime I didn't stay in the role he had grown comfortable with, too far, as if there was a line I was never supposed to cross, as if protecting myself was somehow excessive. I moved slowly toward the window, letting the light settle across my face. For years, I said quietly, I stayed exactly where you wanted me. He didn't look up. I kept things running. I kept things stable. I kept things quiet. Still nothing, and you counted on that. That made him react, just slightly. His shoulders shifted, his jaw tightened. I didn't count on anything he said. I turned toward him. "Yes, you did." He looked up now, finally, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't seen in a very long time. Not control, not confidence, but something closer to recognition. Not of the situation, but of me. "You think I planned this?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately, because that question was more complicated than it sounded. I think I said slowly, "You made a series of decisions, believing there would never be consequences." He exhaled sharply. "That's not the same thing." "No," I agreed. "It's worse." Silence. Then he straightened, pushed himself away from the counter. "What happens now?" he asked. The question hung in the air, simple, direct, and yet layered with everything that had led us here. I took a breath, and for the first time in a long time, I answered without hesitation. "I'm activating the review." He stared at me, as if waiting for something else. A qualification, a hesitation, a softening. It didn't come. "You're serious," he said. "Yes." The word didn't feel heavy. It felt clear. He shook his head slightly. "You know what that means. I do. It won't just affect me. I know. It will impact everything, the company, the properties, the partnerships. I know." Each time he listed a consequence, his voice grew sharper, more urgent, but mine didn't change, because I had already considered all of it, for months, maybe longer. "You're willing to risk all of that?" he asked. I looked at him, really looked, and realized something that surprised even me. "I'm not risking it," I said. "You already did." That stopped him, because it shifted the weight, from me, back to where it belonged. He ran a hand over his face, pacing once across the room before stopping again. "This doesn't have to happen," he said. "We can resolve this privately." Privately. Another familiar word, one that had protected him for years. I shook my head. "It's past that. It doesn't have to be." "Yes," I said quietly. "It does." He looked at me again, longer this time, as if trying to find something familiar in my expression, something he could still influence, still guide, still control. But whatever he was looking for was gone. "You've changed," he said. I considered that, then nodded. Yes, I said, I have. He let out a short breath, almost a laugh. But without humor. Over this, he asked. I shook my head. No, I said, not over this. I paused. Then added, I changed when I realized how long I had been pretending not to see things. That landed differently, not as an accusation, but as a truth. One that belonged to me, not him. He didn't respond, because there was nothing to argue with. I moved away from the window, walking toward the hallway. Where are you going? He asked. Pack a few things, I said. His expression tightened. So you are leaving. I stopped, turned slightly, and looked back at him. Not the way you expected, I said. That confused him. I could see it, because in his mind, leaving meant defeat, submission, acceptance. But that wasn't what this was. I'm not leaving because you told me to. I continued. I'm leaving because I choose to. He didn't speak, and for a moment, neither did I. Then I added, there's a difference. I walked down the hallway slowly, each step measured, intentional, not rushed, not emotional, just deliberate. The bedroom looked exactly the same. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I opened the closet, pulling out a small suitcase. Not large, not dramatic, just enough. Enough for now, because this wasn't about running. It was about stepping away, creating space, letting what needed to unfold. As I packed, my movements were steady, familiar, almost routine. But inside, something had shifted. Not broken, not shattered, but released. Years of tension I hadn't fully acknowledged. Years of compromise I had quietly justified. Years of silence I had mistaken for strength. All of it. Finally settling into something else. Something clearer. Something stronger. When I returned to the hallway, suitcase in hand, Daniel was still in the kitchen. Exactly where I had left him. But he didn't look the same. There was something different in his posture, less certain, less composed. Where will you go? He asked. I met his gaze. There's a place I used to work on years ago, I said. A small inn near the waterfront. He frowned slightly. You're serious about this? Yes. Another silence. Then he said, You're really going to do this? I held his gaze. I already have. And as I walked past him toward the door, I realized something with complete clarity. For the first time in decades, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking towards something. Myself. The inn smelled like lemon oil and old wood. I noticed that before anything else. Not the view. Not the soft light spilling through the tall windows. Not even the quiet hum of the harbor just beyond the porch. The scent. Clean. Grounded. Familiar. It settled something in me I hadn't realized was still unsettled. Mrs. Bennet. I turned at the sound of my name. A woman stood behind the reception desk, mid-50s, kind eyes posture that suggested both warmth and boundaries, the kind of person who didn't ask unnecessary questions, but noticed everything anyway. Yes, I said, we've been expecting you, she replied with a gentle smile. Your room is ready. Of course it was. I had called ahead, not impulsively, not in panic, but with the same quiet certainty I had felt when I told Daniel I was leaving, not running. Choosing. The room overlooked the water. Simple, thoughtfully arranged. Not overly decorated, just enough detail to feel intentional. Whoever designed it understood restraint. Understood that space isn't emptiness, it's breathing room. I set my suitcase down and walked to the window. Boats moved slowly in the distance, their reflections stretching across the surface like something slightly distorted but still recognizable. That felt fitting. Because that's what my life had been for a while now. Recognizable, but distorted. My phone buzzed. Lauren, I didn't hesitate. Hi, I answered. Mom, she said immediately, her voice tight with concern. Are you okay? I closed my eyes for a moment, and for the first time all day, I let myself feel something close to softness. Yes, I said, I am. There was a pause. Then she exhaled. Did it happen? She asked. Yes, another pause. Everything I looked out at the water, everything I repeated. She didn't speak right away, and I understood why. Because when something you've suspected for months finally becomes real, there's no immediate relief, just a different kind of weight. I'm sorry, she said quietly, for what I asked. For not pushing harder, she replied. For not telling you sooner. I knew things were off, but I didn't. You told me, I said gently. I just wasn't ready to hear it. That was the truth. and saying it out loud didn't feel like regret. It felt like clarity. Lauren hesitated. "What are you going to do now?" I turned slightly, resting my hand against the window frame. "I've already started the process," I said. She went still on the other end of the line. "You activated it?" she asked. "Yes." Her breath caught slightly. That's going to trigger everything. I know. And Dad, we'll have to face it," I said calmly. Silence. "Then I'm with you," she said. The words were simple, but they landed deeper than anything else had that day. "Thank you," I replied softly. We didn't say much after that. We didn't need to, because for the first time in a long time, we weren't avoiding the truth. We were standing inside it. After the call ended, I sat on the edge of the bed, letting the quiet settle around me. It wasn't empty. It wasn't lonely. It was steady. That's when I heard the knock. Not loud, not urgent, but deliberate. I stood crossing the room slowly and opened the door. Margaret Lawson stood on the other side, exactly as composed as always. "I thought you might be here," she said. I stepped aside to let her in. "You move quickly," I said. She gave a small, knowing smile. "You taught me to," she replied. That almost made me laugh. Margaret set her briefcase on the small table near the window, opening it with practiced ease. "I've already initiated preliminary steps," she said. "Edward has been informed. He agrees it's time." I nodded. Of course he did. Edward Hayes had been part of my life for longer than Daniel had. He understood caution. He respected foresight. And most importantly, he understood what it meant to protect something before it was too late. "What happens next?" I asked. Margaret pulled out a set of documents. "Formal notice will be issued within the next 24 hours, she explained. From that point forward, all major financial activity within Bennett and Hayes Holdings will be subject to review." I listened carefully, not as someone overwhelmed, but as someone who had already anticipated this. "Access will be restricted," she continued. "Certain transactions will be paused, and any irregularities, past or present, will be flagged for investigation." I nodded slowly, and Daniel Margaret met my eyes. "He will be notified at the same time as everyone else." A pause. Then she added, "He won't be able to control the narrative this time." That mattered, more than I expected, because for years, Daniel hadn't just controlled decisions. He had controlled perception. What people believed, what they ignored, what they never questioned. That was about to change. "Good," I said quietly. Margaret studied me for a moment. "You're calmer than I expected," she said. I considered that, then answered honestly. "I think I've been preparing for this longer than I realized." She nodded. "Yes," she said, "you have." There was a brief silence. Then she asked, "Are you ready for what comes next?" That question carried weight, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I did. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. Margaret closed her briefcase, her movements precise. "Then we proceed," she said. She didn't stay long after that. She didn't need to. Everything that needed to be set in motion already had been. After she left, I returned to the window. The light had shifted. Softer now, warmer, evening settling in, and with it, a sense of inevitability. Because somewhere across the city, in the house I had just left, Daniel was still standing in the space he thought he controlled, still believing, perhaps, that he could fix this, contain it, redirect it. But what he didn't understand yet was that this wasn't something he could negotiate, or charm, or simplify. This was structure. This was consequence. This was everything I had built quietly. Finally doing exactly what it was meant to do. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was holding everything together. I felt like I had finally let go, not of responsibility, but of illusion. And as the last light of the day stretched across the water, I understood something with complete certainty. This wasn't the moment everything fell apart. This was the moment everything began to reveal itself. The morning the notice went out, the city felt different. Not visibly, not dramatically, but I could feel it, like a shift in pressure before a storm. I was sitting at a small table on the inn's porch, a cup of coffee cooling in my hands when my phone lit up. Margaret. "It's done," she said the moment I answered. I didn't ask what she meant. I already knew. "The formal review has been initiated," she continued. "Notifications have been sent to all primary stakeholders." I looked out at the harbor, boats moving slowly, unaware, unchanged. Has he seen it yet, I asked. There was a brief pause. Yes, she said, of course he had, and another pause. Let's just say, he's no longer in control of how this unfolds. That was enough. I ended the call shortly after setting the phone down beside me. For a long moment, I didn't move, didn't think, didn't analyze, because this part was no longer about preparation. It was about impact. And impact takes time to fully land. It didn't take long. By midday, the calls started coming in. First from secondary partners, then from investors, then from people who had never called me directly before but suddenly found it necessary. I didn't answer most of them, not yet, because this wasn't the moment for explanation. It was the moment for exposure. Around noon, Margaret called again. There's a meeting, she said. I didn't need to ask where or why. Who will be there, I asked. Daniel, Edward, myself, 2 external auditors, and now, you. I took a slow breath, of course. There was a brief pause on her end. You don't have to attend in person, she added. We can handle this without you. I considered that. It would be easier. Less direct, less personal. But that wasn't what this was anymore. No, I said. I'll be there. The conference room at Bennett and Hayes Holdings hadn't changed. Same long table, same polished surfaces, same quiet authority built into every detail, but the atmosphere inside it was completely different. Daniel was already there when I walked in, standing near the far end of the table, speaking in low tones to one of the auditors. He stopped the moment he saw me, not surprised, just aware. Edward Hayes sat at the head of the table, composed as always, his presence steady and grounded in a way Daniel's never had been. Margaret stood near him reviewing documents. The room fell quiet as I entered, not out of tension, but out of recognition. Because everyone in that room understood what this moment represented. Not just a review, a shift. I took my seat without speaking, without hesitation. Margaret began. This meeting has been convened in response to the activation of Clause 14B under the Bennett and Hayes Holdings Agreement. She said, her voice clear and precise. No emotion, no interpretation, just fact. Daniel crossed his arms. This is unnecessary, he said. We could have resolved this internally. Margaret didn't look at him. This clause exists specifically for situations where internal resolution is no longer sufficient. Edward spoke then, his voice calm but firm. Daniel, he said, this is not a discussion. It is a process. Silence. Daniel didn't respond because for once, he couldn't redirect the conversation. Margaret continued, we will begin with a review of financial activity over the past 18 months, she said, particularly in relation to capital allocations, vendor payments, and asset transfers. One of the auditors opened a file. Thick, detailed, prepared. This report identifies multiple discrepancies, he said, including inflated invoices, unverified vendor accounts, and irregular fund movement across secondary channels. Daniel stepped forward. These are standard operational variations, he said. Nothing here is outside acceptable parameters. The auditor didn't react. 42% variance on Harbor Street, he said calmly, without corresponding documentation. Daniel didn't answer, because he couldn't. Another file was opened. East Bay portfolio, the auditor continued. Attempted liquidation flagged under restricted asset classification. Edward's expression didn't change, but his voice did, slightly sharper. Explain that, he said. Daniel hesitated. Then it was a strategic consideration, not an executed action. Margaret stepped in. Intent matters, she said, particularly when tied to protected trust structures. The room felt tighter now, more focused, because the conversation had moved beyond surface-level explanations. It was now about accountability. I hadn't spoken yet. I didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said was already being laid out. But then Margaret turned slightly toward me. Sophia, she said you brought forward the initial concern. Is there anything you would like to add? All eyes shifted to me. I didn't rush, didn't dramatize. I simply reached into my bag and placed a single document on the table. Carefully, deliberately. This, I said, is a certified copy of the original ownership and control structure for Bennett and Hayes Holdings. Daniel's expression hardened. Sophia, I didn't stop. This document outlines the exact limitations of unilateral authority over core assets, I continued. I looked at Chloe. She wasn't supposed to be there, but she was, standing near the door, silent, watching. I hadn't noticed her come in, but she had. And now she was part of this moment too. This is the actual property, I said. The phrase landed, not just as words, but as meaning, because it wasn't about the house anymore. It was about truth, structure, reality. I turned the document toward the table, toward everyone, including Daniel. Everything you claimed control over, I said quietly, was never yours to control alone. Silence, heavy, final. Daniel stared at the document, then at me, then away. Because there was nothing left to argue, no narrative left to reshape, no illusion left to maintain. Edward leaned back slightly, his voice measured. This confirms what we've been reviewing, he said. Margaret nodded. And establishes clear violation risk under Clause 14. B. The auditor closed the file. This will proceed to full investigation, he said. That was it. No drama, no shouting, no collapse, just consequence. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak, didn't fight, because for the first time in his life, there was nothing left to control. I sat there for a moment longer, then stood. Not abruptly, not emotionally, just finished. As I walked toward the door, I passed Chloe. She didn't speak, but her eyes met mine, and in them I saw something I hadn't expected. Not guilt, not arrogance, but understanding, and maybe regret. I didn't stop, because this moment wasn't about her or him. It was about something much simpler, much clearer, the truth. And as I stepped out of that room, I realized something with absolute certainty. I hadn't taken anything from Daniel. I had only revealed what was never his to begin with. The fallout didn't explode. It unraveled, quietly, publicly, inevitably. Within 48 hours, the story had moved beyond boardrooms and conference tables. Not in headlines, not yet, but in conversations, calls, emails that began with, "I just wanted to clarify," and ended with careful distance. Partners paused negotiations. Contractors requested confirmation. Investors who once returned Daniel's calls within minutes suddenly needed time to review. Reputation doesn't collapse all at once. It thins. And Daniel's was thinning by the hour. I watched it happen from a distance. Not detached, but no longer entangled. At the inn, mornings became slower, intentional. I found myself sitting on the porch with a notebook I hadn't touched in years, sketching small ideas, layouts, textures, color palettes, design, my work, the part of me I had set aside so long ago, beginning to return quietly like it had just been waiting for space. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't triumphant. It was steady, and that steadiness mattered more than anything else. Lauren came to see me 3 days after the meeting. She didn't call ahead. She didn't need to. I heard her footsteps on the porch before I saw her, and when I looked up there, she was standing in the doorway, her expression somewhere between concern and something softer. "Hey," she said. "Hey," I replied. She stepped inside, glancing around briefly. "It's nice here," she said. "It is," I agreed. There was a pause. Then she crossed the room and hugged me, tightly. Not quickly, and something in me shifted again, not breaking, not releasing, but settling. "I'm sorry you're going through this," she said against my shoulder. I closed my eyes for a moment. "So am I," replied. She pulled back slightly, studying my face. "You don't look like someone who's falling apart," she said. I smiled faintly. "I think I already did that part," I said. She nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said. "I think you did." We sat together near the window, the light soft around us. For a while, we didn't talk about Daniel, or the company, or the investigation. We talked about smaller things, normal things, the kind of things we hadn't allowed ourselves to talk about in years because something larger had always been hanging over us. Eventually, though, it came back. It always does. "What's happening with him?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer right away, because I didn't want to guess, and I didn't want to speculate, but I knew enough. "People are stepping back," I said, "waiting to see what the review finds." Lauren nodded, and if they find something serious, I met her eyes. They will. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, because she had already come to terms with that possibility. "What about you?" she asked. "What about me? Are you—" Going back, the question lingered, not just about the house, but about everything, the life, the structure, the version of myself I had been for decades. I shook my head. "No," I said, "she studied me. Not even if everything settles." I smiled slightly. That's the point, I said. It won't settle the way it used to. She considered that, then nodded. Good, she said. That surprised me. Good, I repeated. Yeah, she said, because I don't think you should go back to something that required you to disappear just to keep it intact. The words landed softly, but deeply, because they were true, and hearing them from her made them harder to ignore. Later that afternoon, my phone rang again. Daniel. I stared at the screen for a moment, then answered. Sophia. His voice sounded different, not weak, not broken, but stripped of something. I was wondering if you'd call, I said. There was a pause. I didn't know if you'd answer. I almost didn't. Another pause. Then, we need to talk. I looked out at the water, calm, unmoving. We already did, I said. No, he replied. Not like this. I didn't respond immediately, because I understood what he meant. This wasn't about the past or the confrontation. This was about what came after. What do you want to talk about, I asked. A breath, then us. I almost laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of disbelief. Us, I repeated. Yes. I closed my eyes briefly, because that word didn't mean what it used to anymore. Daniel. I said quietly, there hasn't been Annis for a long time. Silence. Then that's not true. I didn't argue, didn't push, I just said it is for me. Another pause. Longer this time. I made mistakes, he said. The words were simple, direct, and for a moment I believed he meant them. I know I replied. I didn't think it would go this far. That was the truth. Not about regret, but about expectation. He hadn't expected consequences, and that was the difference. I know that too, I said. His voice softened slightly. Is there any way to fix this? The question lingered, not as manipulation, not as strategy, but as something closer to uncertainty. I thought about it, not emotionally, not impulsively, but honestly. Yes, I said. There was a shift on the other end. Hope. Subtle. But there. You can cooperate with the investigation, I continued. You can be honest. You can take responsibility. A pause. Then that's not what I meant. Of course it wasn't. I let out a small breath. I know. Silence again. Then I meant us. There it was. Clear, direct, and too late. I looked out at the water one more time, then answered. No, I said, not harsh, not angry, just certain. He didn't respond immediately, and when he did, his voice had changed again. Quieter. I understand, he said. I believed him because for the first time, there was nothing left to misunderstand. We ended the call shortly after. No argument, no closure speech, just an ending. Later that evening, I stood on the porch as the sun dipped low over the harbor. The light stretched across the water, warm and steady, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like something was missing. I felt like something had been returned. Not the marriage, not the house, but something far more important. Myself. And I realized something then with complete clarity. The greatest loss in my life hadn't been Daniel. It had been the version of me that believed I needed him to feel complete. And now, that version was gone. Not broken, not taken, just released. Months passed the way they often do after something life-altering quietly, at first, then all at once. The investigation unfolded exactly as Margaret had predicted. Slow, methodical, unavoidable. Every account was reviewed, every transaction traced, every discrepancy examined under a light Daniel could no longer dim or redirect. And when the findings were finalized, there was no ambiguity left. Funds had been moved through secondary vendors. Invoices had been inflated. Allocations had been adjusted without proper authorization. Not enough to look reckless at a glance, but enough when viewed together to reveal intent. Daniel didn't fight the conclusions. Not in the way he used to fight things. There were no grand arguments, no attempts to charm his way out of it, no carefully worded explanations designed to soften the truth. Because for the first time in his life, there was no version of the story that made him look in control. He stepped down from active management of the company shortly after, not dramatically, not publicly, but definitively. Partners distanced themselves. Projects were reassigned. The structure we had built remained intact, but without him at the center of it. Edward Hayes took a more visible role again, steady as ever. Margaret oversaw the transition with the same precision she had always carried. And me, I didn't return. Not to the office, not to the house, not to the life that had required me to disappear in order to maintain it. Instead, I built something new, not from nothing, but from something I had set aside for far too long, my work. It started small. A consultation for a woman a few years younger than me, recently divorced, unsure what to do with the home she had once shared with someone who was no longer there. I don't even know where to begin, she told me, standing in a living room that still felt like someone else's. I looked around, at the furniture that no longer fit her life, at the colors that held memories she didn't want to keep, at the space waiting to be redefined. And I smiled gently. "We don't begin with what's here," I said. She frowned slightly. "Then where do we begin?" "With what you want to feel when you walk into this room," I replied. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Safe." I nodded. "Good," I said. "That's something we can build." That project led to another, and another. Word spread, not quickly but steadily. Women who had been through their own versions of loss, divorce, betrayal, widowhood started reaching out, not just for design, but for something deeper, a way to reclaim space, to rebuild identity, to create environments that reflected who they were now, not who they had been expected to be. I didn't advertise. I didn't need to, because this work wasn't about business. It was about restoration. Lauren visited often, sometimes to help, sometimes just to sit with me on the porch talking about things we had once avoided. Our relationship changed in ways I hadn't expected. Not overnight, but genuinely. There was less distance, less carefulness, more honesty. I used to think you were just okay with everything she told me one afternoon. I looked at her. "I wasn't," I said. "I know that now," she replied. "But back then, it felt like you were choosing not to see things." I nodded slowly. "I think I was choosing not to act on what I saw," I admitted. She considered that, then said quietly, "That must have been exhausting." It was. But I didn't say that, because I didn't feel it anymore. The exhaustion had been tied to something I was no longer carrying. Daniel and I spoke only a few times after everything settled. Always brief, always calm. There was no hostility left, but there was no connection either. Just distance. The kind that doesn't need to be explained. I heard things, of course, about him, about where he was living, about how he was trying to rebuild in smaller ways, quieter ways. I didn't follow it. I didn't need to, because his life was no longer part of mine, and mine was finally my own. One morning, nearly 6 months after I left the house, I drove back there, not to move in, not to reclaim it, just to see it. The gate opened the same way it always had. The driveway curved exactly as I remembered, and the house stood there unchanged, beautiful, still, but different because I was different. I walked through the front door slowly. The air inside was quiet, neutral, no longer filled with tension, no longer holding unspoken things, just space. I moved through each room not with nostalgia, but with awareness. This had been my life, and now it wasn't. When I reached the kitchen, I paused. The same counter, the same light, the same place where everything had shifted. I stood there for a moment, then smiled, not out of triumph, not out of bitterness, but out of understanding, because the house had never been the point. It had never been the victory. The real victory was standing here without feeling small, without feeling dismissed, without feeling like I needed to justify my presence. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. As I walked back out into the sunlight, I felt something settle inside me fully, not as a realization, but as a truth I no longer questioned. I hadn't lost my home. I had found myself. And that was something no one could ever take from me again. There's a moment in every woman's life when she has to decide whether keeping the peace is worth losing herself. For years, I believed silence was strength, that patience would fix things, that understanding someone else's flaws was the same as protecting a relationship. But it isn't. Silence doesn't build strength, it delays truth, and truth always finds its way back. What I learned is this. You can love someone deeply and still recognize when they no longer deserve access to your life. You can build something with another person and still walk away when that foundation becomes unstable. And most importantly, you can start over at any age. Not because you failed, but because you finally chose yourself. If you've ever been in a situation where you felt overlooked, dismissed, or replaced, I want you to know this. You are not powerless, you are not too late, and you are not alone. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't losing what you had. It's realizing you deserve something better. If this story resonated with you, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for yourself? Where are you watching from today? And if stories like this speak to your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your voice in the comments, because your story matters too.